an Austrian software developer, uh, coding completely alone in his bedroom, just built a piece of open source software so intensely powerful that the CEO of NVIDIA publicly called it the most important project in human history.
Yeah, it's a piece of code that could effectively bankrupt the trillion-dollar artificial intelligence industry as we know it today.
Right.
Yeah.
And somehow, the ripple effects of that open source revolution are actively colliding with a massive bottleneck of crude oil in the Middle East, which is then altering the structural cost of the lumber used to build your house.
And even changing the chemical composition of the snacks you might buy on a Tuesday afternoon. It's wild.
It is. So today, we are taking a massive stack of sources. We've got geopolitical military dispatches, macroeconomic data straight from the Federal Reserve, retail earnings reports, biological case studies, and we are mapping out the hidden, invisible architecture of the global economy.
It's a phenomenal stack of material to go through, and I think what becomes immediately clear when you look at all this data at once is that isolation is a myth. We're trained by the news cycle to view a war in one hemisphere, and then an interest rate hike in another, and then a shift in consumer diets as entirely separate phenomena, but they aren't.
Right.
They're the exact same thermodynamic system, just expressing itself through different pressure valves.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, before we unpack this, we need to note that our sources today contain politically charged content covering domestic policies, international conflicts, and figures from both the left and the right. As your guides, we are completely impartial. We are never taking sides or endorsing any viewpoints.
Right, absolutely not.
We are simply conveying the facts, events, and ideas exactly as they are presented in the original source material so you can understand the full picture. Our only allegiance here is to the mechanics of what is actually happening.
Which is so crucial because understanding the mechanics really requires looking at the data coldly. We have to strip away the rhetoric to see the underlying gears turning.
Okay, let's unpack this. We're going to start with the geopolitical gear that is currently grinding the hardest right now. We are looking at the unshackled presidency of Donald Trump, who has placed his administration at the absolute center of the global economy through the use of military authority.
Specifically regarding Iran.
Right. The U.S. and Israeli airstrikes began on February 28th. And in retaliation, Iran hasn't just been attacking cargo ships and energy facilities. They attempted something with staggering geographical implications.
Yeah, this is huge.
They fired 2 intermediate-range ballistic missiles at the joint U.S. and U.K. military base on Diego Garcia.
And the geography of that specific target is what makes this a massive escalation.
Because Diego Garcia isn't even in the Persian Gulf.
No, not at all. It is a tiny, highly militarized atoll in the central Indian Ocean. It's thousands of miles away from the immediate theater of conflict.
Wow.
Yeah, it's the strategic launching pad for U.S. long-range bombers in the region. Now, one of those Iranian missiles failed in flight, and a U.S. warship fired an interceptor at the other one. But the very fact that Iran demonstrated the capability and the willingness, really, to reach across the Indian Ocean, that fundamentally alters the risk calculus for every single piece of commercial shipping in the Eastern Hemisphere.
And the immediate casualty of that altered risk calculus is the Strait of Hormuz.
Yeah.
The traffic through that specific choke point has basically stalled to nearly zero. And we aren't just talking about a slowdown here. We are talking about a full cardiac arrest of a major commercial artery.
Exactly.
20% of the world's crude oil normally flows through that strait. And because it's pinched off, oil prices have violently surged past $112 a barrel.
Which is just staggering.
U.S. gas prices are up 33%. That's nearly $1 a gallon in a single month. And Sana City has laid out a bull case scenario projecting that if this closure persists, we could see oil hit $150 or even $175 a barrel.
And to understand the economic gravity of $175 oil, you have to look at the contradiction in the current administration's public posture.
What do you mean by that?
Well, on one hand, you have President Trump stating categorically that he isn't interested in a ceasefire, utilizing rhetoric about obliterating the opposition.
Right.
But almost simultaneously, he indicates the U.S. is considering, quote, winding down military operations.
Oh, wow. So it's totally mixed signals.
Exactly. And this ambiguity is incredibly difficult for the oil futures market to price in. The market can price in a long war, right? And the market can price in a swift peace. What the market cannot price is radical unpredictability from the commander-in-chief.
Because they just don't know what's going to happen tomorrow.
Right. That volatility bakes a massive risk premium into the cost of every single barrel.
which explains the panic move from the Treasury Department.
Oh, yeah.
U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent just announced a 30-day waiver to unsanction 140 million barrels of Iranian oil that are currently just sitting at sea on tankers.
It's crazy. They're literally trying to legally unlock floating storage that they themselves banned just to flush the market and bring the temperature down.
Just to get some supply out there.
Exactly.
But look, I want to pivot here for a second because the oil narrative kind of obscures something potentially much more devastating. Our sources highlight a Michigan farmer pointing out that U.S. agriculture is in, quote, uncharted territory.
Mm-hmm.
Because if the Strait of Hormuz is blocked and fertilizer components can't get out, aren't we looking at a food crisis, not just a gas crisis?
What's fascinating here is the precise chemical supply chain you're touching on. Modern industrial-scale farming is entirely dependent on synthetic fertilizers.
Like what specifically?
Specifically urea and various phosphates. And massive quantities of those originate in the Middle East and travel through that exact strait.
Wow.
So if a farmer in Michigan cannot acquire affordable fertilizer, the crop yield per acre just completely collapses.
And a mechanical chain reaction.
Right.
The input cost to plant a field of corn skyrockets. And because the corn is more expensive, the cost to feed cattle and poultry skyrockets, which means the cost of the meat in your local grocery store skyrockets. So literally, a missile intercepted over the Indian Ocean mathematically dictates the price of a hamburger in Chicago 6 months later.
That's exactly it. High oil and blocked fertilizer, they act as this massive, invisible tax on the global economy. It is a structural cost increase on every physical item that needs to be grown or manufactured or transported.
Right.
And when you inject that level of structural cost into the system, you force the hand of the Federal Reserve.
Which brings us to the macroeconomic pressure cooker.
Yes.
The Fed just held the short-term federal funds rate at 3.75%. Chair Jerome Powell came out, noted that the housing sector is, quote, weak, and then he just dropped a hammer.
A massive hammer.
The Fed's target inflation rate of 2% has been pushed all the way back to 2028, and they are only projecting a single rate cut in 2026.
You really have to appreciate how dramatic a recalibration that is. I mean, the 2% target is the holy grail of central banking.
Right, they talk about it constantly.
Constantly. Pushing the timeline out to 2028 is essentially the Fed admitting that the inflation we are experiencing is no longer just a monetary phenomenon they can easily crush with high interest rates.
It's deeper than that.
Yeah, it's a structural supply-side phenomenon driven by the exact geopolitical realities we just discussed. But making this even more complex is the unprecedented institutional friction happening at the exact same time.
Oh, you're talking about the DOJ probe.
Yeah.
So the Department of Justice is actively investigating allegations surrounding the Federal Reserve's building renovation project, probing for cost overruns. And this investigation has completely stalled the nomination of President Trump's pick for Fed Chair, Kevin Warsh. And because of this freeze, Jerome Powell has stated he is staying on indefinitely.
This is institutional warfare playing out in real time. The Federal Reserve is designed to be entirely independent from the executive branch.
Right, by design.
Precisely so that monetary policy isn't dictated by political election cycles. So having the Department of Justice investigate the central bank creates an incredibly chilling environment.
Imagine.
Getting inside the president's head to anticipate the next conflict is now basically a required skill for macroeconomic forecasting.
So what does this all mean for the average investor watching their 401k? Because if you want to see the damage that uncertainty causes, you don't look at Apple or Microsoft, right? You look at the Russell 2000.
Exactly.
Our sources confirm the Russell 2000 is the first U.S. benchmark to enter correction territory in 2026. It dropped over 10% from its recent high.
We need to explain mechanically why small-cap stocks are breaking down while the broader market indices might seem fine.
Okay, let's do it.
Small-cap companies are like sailboats, whereas mega-cap tech companies are nuclear submarines.
Okay, I like that analogy.
Right. A company like Apple can dive under a high-interest rate storm because they have over $100 billion in cash acting as ballast. They don't need to borrow money to survive.
They're fully self-funded, basically.
Exactly. But a small-cap company in the Russell 2000 is stuck on the surface. They are financing their daily operations, their payroll, their inventory on rolling short-term credit.
Oh, wow. So they feel the rates immediately.
Immediately. When the Fed holds rates at 3.75% and signals no relief until 2028, the wind just shears the sails off those small companies. Their cost of capital doubles at the exact moment their operating costs are spiking due to energy prices.
So if the small caps are bleeding and the Fed is frozen, why is gold failing?
That's a great question.
Because if you look at historical models, when inflation is sticky and geopolitical fear is high, investors usually flee to gold.
Right.
But gold fell over 6% this week. It's down 10% since the February 28th strikes. Why is the ultimate safe haven asset completely short-circuiting?
It's not short-circuiting, actually. It is responding perfectly to the mechanics of yield.
How so?
Gold is an inert rock. It does not pay a dividend. It does not yield interest.
Right, it just sits there.
It just sits in a vault. When the Fed keeps interest rates high, risk-free, yield-bearing assets like U.S. Treasury bonds become highly attractive.
Oh, I see.
If you're an institutional investor, why hold a vault full of gold that pays you 0% when you can hold short-term government paper that pays you a guaranteed risk-free return?
That makes total sense.
And furthermore, those high interest rates make the U.S. dollar incredibly strong globally. Because gold is priced in dollars, a strong dollar makes gold mathematically more expensive for foreign buyers to purchase in their local currencies.
Which destroys global demand.
Exactly.
So the macro squeeze tightens. You have high rates, high energy costs, and literally nowhere to hide. Let's trace how this abstract financial pressure physically reconstructs specific industries, starting with the housing market.
Yeah, housing is taking a massive hit.
New home sales plummeted 17.6% in January. Now, some of that is whether the Northeast saw a 44.7% drop due to severe blizzards, but the underlying architecture of the market is crumbling. Mortgage rates just shot back up to 6.53%.
And if you look at the behavior of home builders, you see absolute desperation right now.
Really?
Oh, yeah. The data shows 64% of builders are currently using sales incentives just to get foot traffic.
Wow. What kind of incentives?
They are paying out of their own pockets to buy down buyers' mortgage rates for the first few years, or they're just throwing in luxury upgrades completely for free.
Just to move the inventory.
Exactly. But the builders are caught in a trap here because input prices for residential construction are up 3.4% year over year.
And a massive driver of that cost is lumber. Softwood lumber imports into the U.S. just hit their lowest level since 2014.
Yep.
Why? Because Canadian lumber, which historically makes up roughly 80% of U.S. lumber imports, is now getting hit with a combined duty rate of 45%.
This is exactly where macro policy dictates micro-reality.
Right.
A 45% tariff on Canadian softwood doesn't just hurt Canadian loggers. It fundamentally alters the cost to frame a single-family home in Ohio.
Right. Someone has to pay that extra cost.
The builder has to absorb it or pass it to the buyer. But the buyer can't afford it because their mortgage rate is tied to the Fed's battle against inflation, which is exacerbated by the oil shock.
It's just a total vice grip. Let's look at another industry caught in that exact same vice. Commercial aviation.
Oh, this is a fascinating one.
United Airlines just announced they're cutting 5% of their planned capacity for this year. The CEO, Scott Kirby, is actively preparing the airline for oil to stay above $100 through 2027. And he is modeling for the $175 worst-case scenario. If oil hits $175, it adds $11 billion to United's fuel bill.
And to contextualize that number, $11 billion is more than double the net profit United earned in its most lucrative year in history.
That's insane.
Fuel is an airline's second largest expense right behind labor. When that expense doubles overnight, the entire calculus of the route network changes. You have to immediately ground any flight that isn't overwhelmingly profitable.
Right, so you cancel the Tuesday night red-eye to a secondary city because an aircraft burning $175 a barrel jet fuel simply cannot fly half empty. It's like a household budget. If gas prices double, you cancel the weekend road trip.
Right.
United is just canceling the Tuesday overnight flights.
Right.
But let me push back on United's strategy here for a second. Usually when an airline faces an existential cash burn, they furlough pilots and cancel aircraft orders. But United is doing neither.
No, they aren't.
They're keeping their staff and taking delivery of 120 new planes this year. Why absorb all that short-term pain instead of pulling the emergency brake?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it's a ruthless, highly calculated game of corporate survival.
Okay.
United is looking at the landscape and realizing that while $175 oil hurts them, it absolutely obliterates their smaller, low-cost competitors.
Oh, wow. Because they don't have the cash reserves?
Exactly. Budget airlines operate on razor-thin margins and lack the massive credit lines of legacy carriers. So United is betting that if they maintain their fleet and their trained pilot base, which takes years to rebuild if you furlough, by the way,
Right.
they will be perfectly positioned to capture immense market share when the smaller airlines are forced into bankruptcy or massive contraction.
It's cutthroat.
They are literally weaponizing their own balance sheet to starve out the competition.
It's corporate Darwinism fueled by jet fuel. And we are seeing that same consolidation impulse in the media industry right now.
We really are.
Nexstar and Tegna just closed a massive $6.2 billion merger, combining over 260 local broadcast TV affiliates across the country. But to execute this, they needed a special waiver, explicitly endorsed by President Trump, to bypass a decades-old FCC rule that prevents any single company from reaching more than 39% of U.S. TV households.
Which is, as you can imagine, triggering massive antitrust lawsuits from several states, including California and New York, as well as DirecTV.
What's their main argument?
The lawsuits argue that when one conglomerate controls that many local stations, they have disproportionate leverage to demand exorbitant retransmission fees from cable providers.
Which inevitably trickles down to higher cable bills for consumers.
Exactly. Furthermore, there's the concern of homogenized local news, where regional reporting is basically replaced by centralized syndicated content.
The broadcaster's counterargument is essentially, if you don't let us consolidate, we die.
Right.
They argue they cannot compete against the massive advertising monopolies of Google and Meta, or the content libraries of Netflix and Amazon, without achieving massive scale themselves.
It's the exact same logic as United, right? When the macro environment turns hostile, the big cop has to get drastically bigger just to build a moat.
Right. And speaking of hostile macro environments dictated by U.S. policy, we have to look at the geographical whiplash happening in Cuba right now.
Oh, this is a really stark pivot.
The U.S. is currently choking off Cuba's oil supply, which has thrown the island into a literal dark age of massive power cuts. President Trump has escalated rhetoric, floating the concept of a, quote, friendly takeover of the island.
The whiplash really is stunning. A reporter in the sources reflected on covering Cuba just a decade ago, during the 2010s era of normalization.
Right, the Obama years.
Yeah, you had the U.S. Embassy reopening, JetBlue inaugurating commercial flights, Carnival cruise ships docking in Havana.
The Rolling Stones played a massive free concert there.
Exactly. There was this intense, kinetic feeling that the geopolitical ice was finally thawing.
And now the ice hasn't just refrozen, it's practically glacial.
It demonstrates the immense unilateral power of U.S. foreign policy to turn the lights on or off literally in neighboring nations. The trajectory of a nation's economy can be completely inverted by a change in administration in Washington.
It's wild. Sure. So we've traced how macro forces and geopolitics dictate the cost of the physical world, houses, flights, oil. Let's pivot to a completely different kind of revolution that is changing the physical reality of the consumer.
Okay.
It isn't happening in the Strait of Hormuz. It's happening in the human digestive system. We need to talk about GLP-1 agonists.
The scale of the GLP-1 phenomenon, drugs like Ozempic, Wegovy, and Zepbound, is rewriting the baseline assumptions of the entire retail sector.
It really is.
Currently, 1 in 8 U.S. adults are taking a GLP-1 weight loss drug, and J.P. Morgan estimates this could scale to 30 million Americans by 2030.
That is a massive demographic shift.
Massive. And to understand the economic impact, we have to look at the biological mechanism of how these drugs actually work.
Because it's not just an appetite suppressant, right?
Yeah.
It physically rewires the behavioral loop.
Precisely. GLP-1 agonists mimic a naturally occurring hormone that tells your brain you are full. They physically slow down gastric emptying, meaning food literally stays in your stomach longer. But more profoundly, they interact with the reward centers in the brain, dampening the dopamine spike you typically get from consuming high-sugar, high-fat foods.
Wow. So the desire, the actual compulsion to eat, is chemically muted.
Right. And the data on this is terrifying if you are an executive at a food conglomerate.
Oh, I bet.
Users on GLP-1s consume, on average, 21% fewer calories. They spend nearly a third less on their grocery bills.
A third less.
Yes. About 70% of them report snacking significantly less, and traffic for breakfast and fast food dinners is plummeting.
So if you extrapolate a 21% caloric reduction across 30 million Americans, you are looking at wiping out anywhere from $30 billion to $55 billion in annual sales for the food and beverage industry.
So how does a massive consumer packaged goods company survive when 12% of the adult population biologically loses the desire for their core products?
Right. What do they do?
They have to rapidly re-engineer their portfolios. People on GLP-1s still need to eat, but their nutritional requirements change. They need dense protein to prevent muscle mass loss, which is a common side effect of rapid weight loss, and they need fiber to support digestion.
So you see Pepsi abruptly launching protein-packed Doritos and fiber-rich Smart Food popcorn.
Exactly.
Nestle rolled out an entirely new brand called Virtual Pursuit, which is a line of frozen meals specifically portion-controlled and nutritionally balanced for GLP-1 users.
Even J&J Snack Foods, a company literally built on selling massive pretzels and sugary Italian ice at stadiums, is shrinking their portion sizes.
I saw that. They're adding antioxidants to Luigi's Mini Pops, marketing them as hydration aids to combat the nausea associated with medication.
But here is the critical vulnerability in Big Food's pivot. The data pool is incredibly unstable right now.
What do you mean by unstable?
There is a really fragile cycle of behaviors associated with these medications. Currently, about 5% of users lapse. They quit taking the medication, either due to the exorbitant out-of-pocket costs or the gastrointestinal side effects.
Okay.
And when a user quits, they typically maintain their reduced caloric habits for a month or two before eventually reverting to their previous higher caloric baseline.
Which means food manufacturers are trying to hit a moving, fluctuating target.
Yeah.
They don't know if they are selling to a permanent new demographic or just a temporary biological blip.
Right. It's a huge gamble.
But while the food inside the grocery store is fundamentally changing, the way we pay for it is undergoing a massive technological overhaul. Let's look at Walmart. By the end of 2026, Walmart is rolling out digital shelf labels, or DSLs, to every single U.S. store.
Yep, no more paper tags.
They're replacing every paper price tag with a digital screen.
And from an operational logistics standpoint, DSLs are a miracle.
Oh, sure.
Walmart associates report that updating prices, which used to take days of walking the aisles with a barcode printer, now takes a fraction of the time, cutting pricing duties by 75%.
That's incredible efficiency.
It also features LED lights that flash to help delivery drivers locate items instantly, which drastically increases the efficiency of the online order fulfillment process.
But lawmakers are treating these digital screens like a Trojan horse. Senators Jeff Merkley and Ben Ray Lujan have introduced a bill to outright ban DSLs in large grocery stores, labeling them a, quote, gateway to surge pricing.
Yeah, people are very suspicious.
But are we being entirely too cynical here? I mean, I want to challenge this narrative. If dynamic pricing means a gallon of milk is cheaper on a Tuesday morning when store traffic is low, doesn't that actually benefit lower-income shoppers who have flexible schedules?
That's the argument, yeah.
We accept dynamic pricing when we buy a plane ticket or call an Uber. Why do we suddenly moralize the technology when it hits the grocery aisle?
This raises a really important question about the psychology of consumer trust, which is fundamentally different for groceries than it is for transportation.
How so?
You don't buy an airline ticket every week, right? It's a discretionary purchase. But grocery prices are intimately tied to a family's sense of survival, routine, and fairness.
That makes sense.
Consumers possess a mental ledger for the price of eggs, bread, and milk. The fear lawmakers are articulating is that once the digital infrastructure is installed, the capacity for algorithmic price gouging exists.
Oh, I see.
A retailer could theoretically raise the price of umbrellas during a sudden downpour or hike the price of bottled water in the middle of a heat wave instantly across the entire store.
Now, Walmart vehemently denies this, stating the price will remain static and identical for every consumer in the store, and that the tech is simply to align their online and in-store pricing databases seamlessly.
Sure, that's what they say.
But you're right. In an era of sticky, punishing inflation, consumer trust is practically non-existent. A digital price tag that can change with a keystroke feels like an assertion of corporate control over basic human needs.
Exactly. Consumers are just exhausted by complexity and unpredictability, and we are seeing that exact same exhaustion manifest in the automotive market right now.
Oh, yeah.
The pure electric vehicle revolution has hit a wall. EV sales have dropped to just 7.1% of the market.
But hybrid sales are absolutely surging. They're up to 18.4% of new vehicle sales. And Nissan is introducing a technology to the U.S. market in their new Rogue SUV that perfectly captures what consumers actually want right now. It's called the e-Power Series Hybrid.
We need to explain the mechanical brilliance of a series hybrid because it is distinctly different from a traditional Prius-style parallel hybrid.
Okay, break it down for us.
In a series hybrid, the gasoline engine is completely disconnected from the wheels. It acts solely as an onboard generator.
Are you really?
Yes. You fill the tank with regular gas. The engine runs at a steady, hyper-efficient RPM to generate electricity, and that electricity constantly charges a battery, which then uses electric motors to drive the wheels.
So it's basically the ultimate bridge technology.
Exactly.
You get the instant torque, the silent acceleration, and the smooth driving dynamics of a pure EV, but you completely eliminate range anxiety. You don't have to download 6 different apps to find a broken charging station on a road trip. You just pull into a standard gas station, fill up in 3 minutes, and keep driving your electric car.
It's a mechanical reflection of the broader consumer psychology right now. People want the benefits of the future without abandoning the reliable infrastructure of the present. They want simplicity.
And we see this exact same demand for simplicity in personal finance. As inflation pinches wallets, the era of managing a complex spreadsheet to maximize credit card points across rotating categories is ending.
Right. People are just over it.
Our sources specifically highlight the rise in popularity of the Citi Double Cash Card. It is brutally simple. It offers a flat 2% cash back, 1% when you make the purchase, and 1% when you pay the bill.
No travel portals to navigate, no quarterly categories to activate.
It is just a reliable, predictable return. When the macro environment, the Fed, the Middle East, the dynamic grocery prices is chaotic, consumers demand that the micro elements of their lives be totally predictable.
Precisely. The average consumer is pinching pennies looking for a 2% baseline return just to tread water against 3.4% structural inflation. But while the average family is playing a game of defensive budgeting, the people at the very apex of the corporate ladder are playing an entirely different, almost detached financial game.
Okay, let's look at the boardroom data, starting with David Zaslav, the CEO of Warner Bros. Discovery. WBD is in the process of being acquired by Paramount Skydance. From this acquisition, Zaslav stands to walk away with a payout of over $800 million.
Which is just an astronomical figure.
It is. But the payout itself isn't the most shocking part, it's the structure of it. Paramount agreed to a $335 million gross-up payment strictly to cover Zaslav's golden parachute excise tax. We have to explain the math on this because it is staggering.
To understand a gross-up, you really have to look at the history of Section 280G of the tax code. Back in the 1980s, Congress created a 20% excise tax designed specifically to penalize excessive outsized payouts to CEOs during corporate mergers.
Right. The legislative intent was to disincentivize corporate greed and protect shareholders.
But instead of preventing the payouts, corporate boards just turned the tax penalty into a line item.
Wait, how does that work?
The math of a gross-up means the company says, we want to pay the CEO $500 million. The government is going to hit him with a massive tax penalty for taking that much. So we, the company, will pay the CEO an additional amount of money specifically to pay that tax.
But wait, because that additional money is also considered taxable income, they have to pay the tax on the tax.
Yes, creating an infinite compounding loop of compensation.
That is wild. It completely inverts the intent of the law. A mechanism designed to punish executive greed ends up costing the shareholders hundreds of millions of dollars extra just to shield the CEO from the consequences.
It is the ultimate manifestation of the disconnect between the ultra-wealthy elite and the standard economic rules.
And we are seeing a massive cultural shift among that ultra-wealthy elite regarding how they view their obligations to society. Look at the Giving Pledge. This is the initiative started by Warren Buffett and Bill Gates, urging billionaires to publicly commit to giving away the majority of their wealth to philanthropic causes.
But the Giving Pledge is currently facing a severe ideological billionaire backlash.
Really?
Yeah. The pace of new signers has slowed to a trickle, and prominent figures are actively turning against it. Peter Thiel, the venture capitalist, recently criticized it aggressively, referring to it as an, quote, Epstein-adjacent fake boomer club.
Wow, those are strong words.
Yeah, and he successfully convinced Brian Armstrong, the CEO of Coinbase, to voluntarily withdraw his signature from the pledge.
What is the philosophical argument here? Why are tech billionaires suddenly branding philanthropy as obsolete?
It is the rise of techno-capitalist accelerationism.
Okay, what does that mean?
This new class of elite believes that traditional nonprofit charity is a performative, inefficient charade. They argue that the most effective way to elevate humanity is not by giving money to NGOs, but by aggressively deploying capital to build companies, fund radical technological progress, and drive economic growth.
So they think building a commercial rocket company or an artificial intelligence lab does more for the future of humanity than any traditional philanthropic foundation ever could.
Exactly. It's a complete rejection of the 2010s corporate social responsibility model.
By the way, amidst this heavy philosophical debate, there was a brilliant humanizing detail in the sources regarding Warren Buffett defending the pledge. He briefly mentioned his old editor, Carol Loomis, who edited his legendary shareholder letters for decades.
Oh, I love this part.
Buffett admitted that he used to get furious because she would constantly add commas to his writing. He joked, "I finally matured a little bit at 95. Even the Oracle of Omaha hates being copy-edited."
It's a rare moment of humility from the billionaire class, which stands in stark contrast to the legal drama surrounding Elon Musk right now.
Yeah, let's talk about that. A California jury recently delivered a massive verdict against Musk, finding that he explicitly defrauded Twitter shareholders in the 2022 run-up to his $44 billion acquisition.
The jury determined that Musk made materially false and misleading public statements regarding the number of bot accounts on the platform.
Right. The legal theory is that he intentionally created chaos to depress the stock price and force the board into a cheaper deal. And the total damages for this fraud could reach $2.6 billion.
It is a profound legal rebuke. But if we connect this to the bigger picture of extreme wealth, we have to evaluate the actual punitive weight of that number.
That's the exact thought experiment. For any other human being or corporation, a $2.6 billion penalty is a life-ruining, generationally devastating event. But Elon Musk's net worth fluctuates around $650 billion.
Right.
Mathematically, $2.6 billion is less than half of 1% of his total wealth. If someone with a net worth of $100,000 gets a $400 speeding ticket, that hurts. This penalty is proportionally less than that speeding ticket.
Which forces us to ask whether the legal system possesses any actual punitive capability over individuals operating at that sheer scale of capital.
Exactly.
It suggests that past a certain threshold of wealth, legal penalties transition from being deterrents to simply being operational costs of doing business.
But it's important to note that not all massive, intergenerational wealth operates with that level of chaotic friction. Our sources profile Jenny Johnson, the CEO of Franklin Templeton. She is the third generation to lead her family's $1.7 trillion asset management empire.
Which completely defies historical precedent.
Yeah, there's the famous adage regarding family businesses, shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. The first generation builds the wealth from nothing. The second generation grows and manages it. And the third generation, detached from the initial struggle, squanders it. So how did the Johnson family break the curse?
By instituting ruthless institutional meritocracy over familial monarchy.
Also,
They established deeply ingrained shared values, but more importantly, they aggressively place the best talent in the right roles, irrespective of ego. For instance, her brother, Greg Johnson, previously served as CEO, but transitioned to running the San Francisco Giants baseball franchise because his strategic talents aligned better there.
Yeah, interesting.
Jenny wasn't handed the CEO role by default. She had to present her vision and be rigorously vetted by an external review board against highly qualified outside candidates. They separated the emotional ties of the family from the operational requirements of a trillion-dollar firm.
it's basically a masterclass in governance. But here's where the narrative of the global economy takes its sharpest turn. All of these massive corporate empires, from Franklin Templeton to Warner Bros. To the tech monopolies, rely on massive, impenetrable moats.
Right.
But those moats are suddenly under siege, not by rival corporations, but by decentralized, open-source code. Let's talk about the AI rebellion.
This is arguably the most structurally significant technology story of the decade. For the past 2 years, the narrative has been entirely dominated by companies like OpenAI, Google, and Anthropic building massive proprietary large language models, or LLMs.
Right, which require billions of dollars in specialized compute to train and run.
Exactly. But a few months ago, an independent Austrian software developer named Peter Steinberger released an open source project called OpenClaw.
It has a lobster theme, OpenClaw, but its capabilities are terrifying to the establishment. OpenClaw isn't an LLM, it is an AI agent framework. We need to explain the technical difference between the model and the framework, because that is where the revolution is actually happening.
Okay, think of the large language model like the core of ChatGPT as the brain. It contains the knowledge and the reasoning capability. But a brain in a jar can't actually do anything.
Right.
OpenClaw is the framework. It gives the brain hands, eyes, and tools. It allows developers to build fully autonomous AI agents that can browse the web, read your local files, execute code, and manage your calendar.
And crucially, OpenClaw is designed to run locally on standard consumer hardware, like a Mac Mini sitting on your desk.
Yeah.
You don't need the massive centralized cloud infrastructure of big tech.
At NVIDIA's massive GTC developer conference, CEO Jensen Huang didn't just mention OpenClaw, he centered it. He called it the most popular open source project in the history of humanity and explicitly labeled it the next ChatGPT.
Which is an astonishing validation from the company that literally builds the hardware powering the entire industry. What OpenClaw proves is that highly capable autonomous AI doesn't need to be rented from a centralized monopoly.
Exactly. It dramatically accelerates the commoditization of the foundational models. Developers are realizing they can take a much cheaper open-weight model, or even a highly efficient Chinese model, plug it into the OpenClaw framework on their own computer, and achieve enterprise-grade results without paying exorbitant API access fees to OpenAI.
Here's where it gets really interesting. OpenAI is absolutely terrified of this commoditization. How do we know? Because Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, just aggressively hired Peter Steinberger.
Yep.
They absorbed the creator of OpenClaw in-house in an obvious attempt to capture and contain that open source magic.
Because they recognize the existential threat to their business model. If the underlying models become commoditized utilities like electricity or water, and the open source agent frameworks like OpenClaw become the valuable appliances that users actually interact with, the economic foundation of OpenAI shifts entirely.
Right. Where is the trillion-dollar valuation if the intelligence becomes fundamentally free and locally managed?
And NVIDIA sees this paradigm shift perfectly. They aren't trying to fight the open source wave. They are building the infrastructure for it. NVIDIA announced they are building a suite of free security services dubbed NemoClaw.
Why do they need security services for it?
Because right now, large enterprise businesses are terrified to let open source AI agents loose on their highly sensitive internal networks. NVIDIA is stepping in to provide the enterprise-grade security guardrails to help corporations adopt OpenClaw safely.
They want to ensure that whether you use a proprietary model or an open source framework, you are still ultimately running it on NVIDIA's silicon.
Exactly. And the open source community is iterating at lightning speed. An independent developer named Gavriel Cohen built an offshoot called NanoClaw.
What does that do?
It allows users to safely run complex AI agents directly within WhatsApp. You can text an agent to manage your business inventory, schedule meetings, or track dynamic prices entirely within the chat interface. It pulls the power of AI out of a specialized web browser and injects it into the communication protocols we already use continuously.
Speaking of web browsers, OpenAI is simultaneously trying to figure out how to monetize their massive consumer base by testing ads within ChatGPT. But the advertising industry is apparently furious with them.
Very furious.
Ad agencies committed massive experimental budgets between $200,000 and $250,000 just for alpha testing. But OpenAI is rolling the ad integration out so slowly and conservatively that the brands literally cannot spend the money they've allocated.
Well, OpenAI's hesitation is completely understandable. Embedding advertisements into a conversational AI, an entity that users are beginning to trust for objective reasoning, is a massive psychological risk.
Yeah, because if the AI recommends a product, is it because it's the best answer or because it's the sponsored response?
Exactly. That ambiguity destroys user trust. And Anthropic, OpenAI's chief rival, is capitalizing on this exact hesitation. They ran a highly targeted Super Bowl commercial explicitly criticizing OpenAI's pivot toward advertising, guaranteeing that their platform, Claude, will remain entirely ad-free. It is a battle over the fundamental user experience of the future internet.
And while the software titans battle for user trust, the physical hardware required to run all of this, the actual silicon chips, has become the most lucrative contraband on the planet.
It really has.
Supermicro, a massive, historically stable server manufacturer, saw its stock plunge 33% practically overnight. Why? Because their co-founder, Wally Lyle, was indicted by the U.S. government for running a massive smuggling ring.
The logistics of this indictment read like a geopolitical thriller. Lyle and his associates are accused of smuggling $2.5 billion worth of equipment containing highly restricted, export-controlled NVIDIA AI chips directly into China.
Why do they even do that?
They utilized a complex network, funneling the hardware through a middleman company in Southeast Asia to generate fraudulent end-user paperwork.
They literally built dummy servers.
Yes.
When U.S. export control officers traveled to Southeast Asia to physically inspect the facilities and verify the chips weren't going to China, the smugglers showed them hollowed-out dummy servers. The actual NVIDIA chips had already been secretly detached and shipped to Chinese buyers.
$2.5 billion worth of silicon moved completely under the radar.
It proves that the geopolitical walls and export controls governments try to mandate are incredibly porous when the financial incentives are this astronomical.
It brings us full circle back to the central theme of geopolitics and physical reality. Whether you are trying to blockade crude oil in the Strait of Hormuz or restrict the flow of silicon chips to geopolitical rivals, the global choke points are highly vulnerable and the market will always seek a way around the blockage.
So we have covered a staggering amount of ground today. We've mapped out wars, inflation, weight loss drugs, billionaire taxes, and AI smuggling rings. To close this out, let's step away from the macroeconomic spreadsheets and ground this back in humanity and culture.
Let's do it.
Let's talk about BTS.
The K-pop supergroup just held their first concert in over 3 years in Seoul, having completed their mandatory military service. The anticipation and the logistical mobilization were unprecedented.
Right. Local authorities prepared for a physical influx of 260,000 fans. They shut down the historic downtown core of Seoul, erected massive barricades, and deployed 8,200 security personnel to manage the anticipated chaos.
But the physical reality was drastically different. Only about 40,000 people actually showed up in person at the stadium.
However, that wasn't a failure of popularity. It was a shift in medium. Millions of people streamed the concert globally, live on Netflix. Their comeback album, Orang, sold nearly 4 million physical and digital copies in a single day.
And industry analysts are currently projecting their upcoming world tour could gross $1.8 billion.
Wow.
A number that directly rivals the economic impact of Taylor Swift. What is fascinating here is the evolution of the global community. The physical gathering in Seoul was smaller than the authorities anticipated, but the digital convergence was monolithic.
The BTS army spans 190 countries. It is a demonstration of pure human connection and shared cultural experience operating on a hyper-global, decentralized scale, facilitated entirely by technology.
And we can contrast that massive, hyper-global digital scale with a deeply personal, intimate story about human connection found in our sources.
You're talking about the CNBC Cures initiative.
Yes. CNBC recently launched an initiative dedicated to bringing the stories of rare, often overlooked diseases to a national broadcast audience. The anchor, Becky Quick, premiered a deeply personal documentary detailing her own family's private battle following her daughter Kaylee's diagnosis with SYNGAP1, which is a rare genetic disorder.
It highlights the agonizing structural gap between the incredible pace of modern scientific advancement and the stark lack of funding or commercial access for the 30 million Americans living with a rare disease.
But much like the global fandom of BTS, progress in the space relies entirely on the power of decentralized community. It is patient advocacy groups, parents, and researchers rallying together to demand regulatory reform, pool funding, and drive scientific innovation forward when the broader market ignores them.
It is a profound reminder that despite the heavy macroeconomic pressures we've discussed, despite the geopolitical conflicts, the sticky inflation, and the corporate maneuvering, human resilience, art, and the fierce fight for the people we love continue to thrive. The human element endures beneath all the data.
It is the one constant in the equation.
Okay, let's quickly recap the massive map we've drawn today. We started with ballistic missiles intercepted over the Indian Ocean, revealing how the Strait of Hormuz dictates whether crude oil hits $175 a barrel.
Which in turn acts as an invisible tax that forces the Fed to push inflation targets to 2028 and freezes the housing market.
Right. We traced how a 45% tariff on Canadian lumber structurally alters the cost of building a home, and how United Airlines uses its balance sheet to survive an $11 billion fuel spike by starving out its competitors.
We explored the biological revolution of GLP-1 agonists, which are chemically altering consumer desires and forcing big food to entirely reinvent their product lines.
We debated the psychology of Walmart replacing paper tags with digital screens, exploring whether it's an efficiency upgrade or a gateway to algorithmic surge pricing. We broke down the staggering math of a $335 million tax gross-up for a media CEO and examined the philosophical shift away from philanthropy by the tech elite.
We marveled at how an independent developer in Austria wrote a lobster-themed open-source code that proved you can run a genius AI on a standard desktop, effectively terrifying the trillion-dollar tech monopolies and leading to a $2.5 billion smuggling ring of NVIDIA chips.
And finally, we witness the unbreakable spirit of human connection, whether it's millions converging digitally for a K-pop concert or a mother leveraging a national platform to fight for a cure for her daughter.
All of which brings us to a final, vital thought to leave you with. Think back to our opening premise regarding the myth of isolation. We live in an era where the boundary between the physical and the digital, the global and the personal, has completely collapsed. The geopolitical maneuvers of world leaders dictate the literal structural material of your house. A single line of open-source code written in a bedroom in Austria might soon manage your daily calendar and your finances.
So the question you have to chew on as you navigate this reality is this. In a world where every domino is tied to every other domino, are we more empowered by this hyper-connected architecture, or are we infinitely more vulnerable to its bottlenecks?
It's a heavy question.
That is exactly the question to sit with. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the systems around you, keep looking for the hidden mechanics driving the headlines, and we will see you next time.